want to thank NBR for asking Mark and I to speak today. I know this is an Asia discussion today. Mark and I we talk about China. So if you're expecting something more out of us, you're just going to have to give up right now, because we'll be talking China. And then I'll speak, and then Mark will speak, and then we'll take some questions. But the U.S. China Working Group it has 52 members now, Democrats and Republicans. We've already had 2 well-attended events this year, including a briefing from David Sedney from the Department of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense. And in May, we'll be taking a delegation of members to China to discuss with our Chinese counterparts the global recession, mainly. That'll be the main issue that we discuss, and share some thoughts on the follow-up thoughts to this week's meetings in the G20, as well as the meeting that President Obama will have with President Hu. I will say this: the most important security relationship the United States has in Asia is with Japan, has been with Japan, will always presumably be with Japan. So I say this not to get in the grill of our good Japanese friends, but I say this because I think it is the case that the most important bilateral relationship the U.S. has to develop in Asia is the U.S.-China relationship. Over the next century, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll get into that. And I'm glad to see that the administration has initially laid out at least this theory of defense, saying that these meetings were indicated that these meetings were the best set of talks, and that's a quote, a best set of talks that he'd ever been a part of. So there are some things obviously taking place in the U.S.-China relationship and from a broad brush perspective. And although we don't have details yet, there was a story earlier this week about Secretary Geithner and Secretary Clinton announcing sometime this week an unveiling of a follow-on to the strategic and economic dialogue that was introduced by the Bush administration. So there are some important steps taken, and obviously some important steps yet to take. However, the last few months obviously been a little bumpy on the road as well, and they serve as a reminder that the U.S.-China relationship is not that easy sometimes. In January, the official Chinese government reacted harshly to Secretary Geithner's line in his written testimony to the Senate about currency manipulation. Last month, we had a flare-up, some call it flare-up, some have other terms for it, in the South China Sea when 5 Chinese vessels harassed the USNS Impeccable while it was doing operations in the South China Sea, leading the president to dispatch U.S. destroyers at the appropriate times, not for every mission, but appropriately to ensure the safe passage of these American ships. So clearly there's some work yet to be done in this relationship. At the first order of business, I think most folks are focused on right now is the global economic crisis. And the World Bank's latest estimate of global economic growth in 2009, released just yesterday, forecasts a contraction of 1.7% compared to an economic growth last year of about 1.9%. This would be the first decline, according to the World Bank, the first decline in the global economy since World War II. We also face a 6% drop in the volume of trade in goods and services, the largest decline in 80 years. It's 80 years. As the G20 meets in London this week, the U.S. and China must be partners in moving forward to solve this crisis. As the World Bank President Bob Zoellick has said and written, without a strong G2, the G20 will disappoint. Specifically, it's my view that the U.S. and China must lead within the G20 family of nations to avoid protectionist measures or otherwise add barriers outside of the existing international rules-based system. At their last meeting in November, the leaders of the G20 pledged to fight anti-trade policies. However, a recent World Bank report found that of the G20 members, 17 of them, I don't know what the math is, 85%? 85% have failed to keep that promise. Now, that's unacceptable, and the U.S. and China, both on the list of 17, must lead by example by not raising tariffs, imposing import restrictions, reinstating subsidies, and encourage their neighbors to do the same. While a global recession is clearly a priority for all countries, between the U.S. and China, there are a number of other opportunities where we can work together in a constructive manner. In anticipation of President Obama's meeting with President Hu, Mark and I have sent a letter to the White House outlining some of these areas. Two include Afghanistan and climate change. First on Afghanistan. With the possible closure of the Manas Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, NATO and the U.S. allies could be left with fewer supply routes into Afghanistan. For those tracking this, it's been in the papers. The U.S. and China could work together to establish an additional supply line into Afghanistan through China's eastern border, as one example of cooperation. On climate change, the U.S. and China share much in common. Both nations are the world's, unfortunately, top polluters, with the U.S. the top emitter on a per capita basis and China as the highest emitter overall. So both share a common interest in energy reform and reducing demand for fossil fuels. Any international framework to limit carbon emissions will only succeed if both countries are on board. And Secretary Clinton's recent visit to China rightly placed environmental cooperation as a high-level agenda item in the U.S.-China relationship. Congress will be taking up a climate change bill this year, presumably, from what I read, presumably sometime in May, the House will take it up. So I'm looking forward to that timeline, and I know you are too. It's my view that we should move forward on this climate change bill. It's also my view that the agreement between our two nations, between the U.S. and China on climate change, will further enhance our ability to deal with global climate change. There are other areas that the U.S. and China share a common interest. Three I'll just briefly highlight. We highlighted in this letter. Space cooperation, the U.S. and China. Some water. All right, get some water. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Mark, take some water.
This is impressive bipartisan.
I tell you. Now, wait till he starts to cough.
He's been carrying your water for quite a while.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. On space cooperation, the U.S. and China need to establish a joint rescue capability. As NASA develops the new crew exploration vehicle, discussions should begin on a common docking ring that allows U.S., China, and Russia to rescue each other's space crews. This is an issue that Mark and I have been talking about for some time, and actually Mark's been more the leader on that. Another area of cooperation is counter-narcotics. Profits from Afghan heroin directly support narco-Taliban forces, and in China, Afghanistan is quickly replacing Burma as a primary source of heroin, especially in the West, according to law enforcement in Western China. Expanded counter-narcotics cooperation to stop heroin trafficking from Afghanistan is in the best interest of the U.S. and China. Lastly, to protect U.S. interests and expand our multilateral engagement, the U.S. and China should begin a dialogue on the establishment of both international conventions banning space debris and international conventions on cybercrime. Both pose serious threats to U.S. interests, and conventions on these issues would be a positive step forward for the U.S. and China. So there are a number of challenges that I think we can overcome if the United States and China can partner. And I think that we've established a couple of good first steps over the last several years, and over the last several months, the Obama administration has continued firming up those foundations to take further action on our relationship with China. With that, I'll end my comments and turn it over to Mark Kirk, the gentleman from Illinois 10th.
Well, as you heard from Rick, we had quite an extensive agenda with China. For me, coming back after a long election, in my reserve duty, am the Deputy Director of Intelligence for the National Military Command Center. Sometimes we have busy days, sometimes we have calm days. About a month ago, I was in there on a Saturday, and the game was on. There wasn't much going on. In fact, as far as I could tell from the NMCC's viewpoint, no one was getting killed anywhere. It could not have been a more boring day, so I was doing a lot of Navy admin. After a day like that, I came in the following day on Sunday, now it was loaded for bear. I had a book. I had a number of things to research for my civilian job, a bunch more Navy admin to do. And as I walked up to relieve the watch, I said, what's going on? And they said, well, we got this major naval confrontation going on with China right now. And I said, yeah, that's great. You guys all know that I work a lot on China on Capitol Hill. What's really going on? I said, no, dude, we have a major naval going on with China right now. You got to be kidding me. Coming out of it impeccable, and what happened, I think our job on the Hill is to calm the anger that would come out of that, or any kind of panic moves. From Rick and I's viewpoint, the United States Congress, when it's controlled by Republicans, sees China as a military threat, and some of that is accurate, some of that is not. Under Democrats, they see China as an economic threat, and for the two of us, we are both free traders, and want to make sure that we're continuing to remember the lessons of history, that rampant protectionism by the Congress was the policy of the U.S. government in 1930 and 31. Probably one of the worst economic decisions ever made by the elected representatives of the American people, and to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So as we come out of impeccable, as we are now watching to the President Obama, President Hu Jintao summit today, I think we are getting back on track for a stable and many-level dialogue with China, which I'll go even further than Rick. Not the most important bilateral relationship for the U.S. and Asia. It is the most important bilateral relationship of the United States in the 21st century. When I look at beyond impeccable, what we need to be talking about, probably most important in Washington State and certainly in Illinois is the role of the dollar, and making sure that my hope is over time that we dramatically limit any plans to monetize U.S. debt. That if we are going on the road that we appear to be going, in some ways I understand countries that would want to unhook from the dollar if we're debasing our currency this quickly. And so a message that I think the president is receiving loud and clear in the G20 is reduce your borrowing, and certainly worries about monetizing U.S. debt, i.e. printing money to buy U.S. securities, is a long-term road to failure, and one that would cause a number of people to try to unhook from the dollar if that happens. China there has one of the loudest voices, and I think it's awfully ironic to have a formerly communist country calling on us to be more private sector and more conservative in our economic policy. And my hope is that we listen. This is an awfully ironic G20 summit in which President Sarkozy has said he will pull out and not participate if the normal communique is drivel and doesn't say something about fiscal responsibility and the need to act. And I think in some ways he is very right on that. As we look forward, I'm also particularly concerned about what's happening in Eastern Europe, the potential financial collapse of a number of major countries who, when the Berlin Wall fell, were pretty small potatoes and could be handled by the resources available to the IMF. But when we look at an economy of the size of, for example, Poland or Hungary right now, future bailouts could quickly eclipse the size of the IMF. So as we look at resources to morph the IMF, as I think it should, into an international Fed, the role of China becomes critical in providing additional resources and making sure that they're most effectively leveraged and coordinated with other countries. Doing that on 18th Street in Washington, D.C., with an enhanced role for China is very important. I hope on the sidelines of the discussion today in London, we talk about an issue near and dear to my heart, which is the additional, as the Pentagon would so inartfully call it, GLOCs for Afghanistan, ground lines of communication to Afghanistan. In December, I became the first member of Congress to deploy into an imminent danger area since 1942, when I served with NATO RC South forces in Kandahar. As we wrote the first draft of the surge to Afghanistan, largely been endorsed by the president, we saw so much combat power on its way to Afghanistan that we will regain the initiative in that country. But the large number of airframes and men, material, and ammunition that's going to be required quickly eclipses the current capabilities of the ground lines of communication across Afghanistan. And so, as Rick pointed out, also the constriction of Manaus makes us look at other options. And we have had a very productive early dialogue with China, especially in the key area that I saw in Afghanistan, which is fuel, and the ability to bring that in to a mission that, quite frankly, I think is extremely in China's interest to support, given what we learn is happening in Western China of a growing danger, not just to the United States, not just to Pakistan, not just to European cities, but also to Western China from the narco-Taliban, which has risen quite dramatically. For the long haul, for the China Working Group, I'm hoping in this Congress we also pass some longer-term pieces of legislation that Rick and I have both backed. As a State Department appropriator, I've been leading the way, and Rick helping out to expand the diplomatic footprint of the United States in China. China is a unique place where the threat of domestic terrorism is extremely low, and so the ability to put U.S. diplomats basically behind an office door and key is something that I think is an acceptable level of risk. And so to expand places beyond Wuhan to 10 other locations originally that Secretary Rice proposed, and I hope Secretary Clinton continues momentum on, is a good thing. But also for the United States to have expanded Chinese diplomatic facilities here, I think would help increase the transparency of both governments and both societies to each other, since they're becoming so important. In the long run, Rick has put forward legislation on small business access to the Chinese market, which is important in two respects. One, in any political discussion in Washington, we need to talk about expanding employment and preserving people's jobs. But more importantly, this is obviously where half of all Americans work, and it allows us to expand the political coalition behind a stable and productive dialogue with China, which leads to a happy 21st century instead of the other way around. And then my long-term wish is that following in the footsteps of the most powerful politician in the Midwest, certainly in my state, Mayor Daley, his big thing, Rahm Emanuel, when he was a congressman, we used to have competitions in our delegation meetings of who could suck up to the mayor more. Who won? Yeah, I always won. His big thing, and now my big thing in the Congress, is to expand Chinese language instruction in high schools and colleges. It is daunting for us to see 200 million Chinese with some formal academic training in English, and roughly 60,000 Americans having the opposite experience, and closing that gap should be the policy of the United States, and something that we accomplish in some degree to lay the foundation for further understanding and cooperation. My hope is that the summit goes well today. We laid out in our letter that Rick described a fairly ambitious agenda. And my general sense is, following impeccable, things are getting back on track, and that is absolutely necessary for the foreign policy of this Congress and of the Obama administration. A close and cooperative relationship with China is essential to success of the presidency and of our economy. And that's nice to say in a speech, but then you have to then go through all the sub-issues as we have dealt in. With 52 members, and I hope growing, my last thing is I hope we have, and this is something that we've called on China to do, a much more vigorous dance card of high-level visits to Washington. That is essential and key to the dialogue with the Congress. We've gone through a drought here following the party Congress and then our election. And now, with a new team coming online in the U.S. administration and the new Congress, we really need high-level Chinese visits to Washington, and hope we can get that rolling. And we plan to be the host of those groups. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.